Tēnā koutou, thank you so much for joining us today. This is a session on the Wellbeing chapter of the Climate Change Commission's draft advice to government on the direction of policy for the second emissions reduction plan. My name is Maya Nath. I'm a principal analyst at the Climate Change Commission. I'll be serving as the facilitator for today's session. So in a moment, I will go over how this webinar will run, but I'd like to first introduce Bevan Hunter, who will open our Zui with karakia. Tēnā koe, Bevan.
Kia ora, ngā mihi nui kia tātou I runga I te pāka whakaata reo nei, tēnā koutou katoa, anei te karakia tīmatanga. Whakarongo ki te tuia, tuia I runga, tuia I raro, tuia I roto, tuia I waho, tuia ki te here tangata I takea mai. I Hawaii nui, I Hawaii roa, I Hawaii pāmāmao. Te hono ki wairua ki te whai ao, ki te ao marama. Ti hei rā mauri ora. Kia ora tātou.
Kia ora, Bevan. Thank you very much. So today you'll hear from some of the expert staff at the Climate Change Commission who will take you through an overview of our draft advice, as well as this public consultation that we're in currently. And we'll specifically be taking a look at the key points from the Wellbeing chapter. If you're comfortable, I'd like to ask everyone if you would kindly use the chat section to share your name and, if applicable, the organization that you're representing. That's just so we have a sense of who's joining us today. That would be much appreciated. Thank you. At the end of today's presentation, there will be an opportunity to have your questions answered. So if you have a question that you'd like to ask, there is a Q&A button, which you should find at the sort of on the ribbon at the bottom of the Teams screen. And you're welcome to send through a question at any point during the presentation. Once the presentation has concluded, we will do our best to get to every question that has come through. However, if we don't have time, you are welcome to send through your questions directly to us. The email address for that is hello@climatecommission.govt.nz. But like I said, if at any point during the presentation you have a pātai, you're welcome to send it through that Q&A button at the bottom of your Teams screen. I'd also like to remind everyone that this session is being recorded today, so that will be made available on the Climate Change Commission's website following this presentation. That way, if anyone wanted to join us today but was unable for any reason, they can still access this discussion. So if you know of anybody who would like to have been here, please let them know so they'll be able to have a look at what we've discussed today. I'll now introduce Barry Anderson, who is the General Manager for Sector Analysis at the Commission, who is going to be taking us through the Wellbeing presentation. Kia ora, Barry.
Kia ora, everyone. Thanks, Maya, and thanks to everyone for joining us on this lovely Friday afternoon for this Zoom. Wellbeing is something that affects all New Zealanders, so we appreciate you attending today, as well as those who will watch later on the website. The input we receive from this consultation webinar and as well through the consultation window will strengthen and improve our final advice to government. The structure for today is I will provide some context for the Commission's work done till date and for the Wellbeing work as a whole. I'll also speak to two Wellbeing recommendations around expanding the scope of equitable transition strategy currently underway, and the government using existing levers to manage the impact of emissions reduction actions and policies on those least able to adapt or who are disproportionately affected. I always have to say that one slowly or else I'll end up mixing it up. And then I think that's next slide, please. Yeah. First, a reminder of the role of the Climate Change Commission. We are an independent Crown entity. We provide regular, independent, evidence-based advice to government on climate issues. Our advice is founded on the science, evidence, and analysis carried out by our experts on staff, and importantly, based on input from stakeholders and the people of Aotearoa New Zealand. As part of our independence, the conclusions and recommendations of the Commission are made by our board of 8 appointed commissioners, not by a minister or cabinet. Next slide, please. The Commission's role and tasks are set out in the Climate Change Response Act. This slide shows the advice we are required to give over the next 2 years. It's kind of scary for some of us. Today's session focuses on the item in red, draft advice to inform the strategic direction of the government's second emissions reduction plan. This plan will cover the years 2026 to 2030, which is the second emissions budget period, and also look ahead to the third emissions budget period, 2030 to 2035, and beyond. Our final advice is due by the end of this calendar year, December 2023. It is then the role of government to consider our advice and decide on the specific policy choices to include in its second emissions reduction plan that will be in effect for the 2026 to 2030 window. We opened consultation on this draft advice in April, and our 8-week consultation period will close next Tuesday, the 20th of June. We will then analyze submissions, review our draft, and make any changes as required that will strengthen and improve our final advice. It is worth reiterating on this point that while our advice is out now for consultation, we truly view it as draft. And if we learn something through this consultation period that forces us to change our understanding, we will adapt and evolve. This is the second time the Commission is providing advice to the government for an emissions reduction plan. Following the release of our 2021 advice, named Aotearoa New Zealand, the government released and is in the process of implementing its first emissions reduction plan for the first budget period, which was 2022 to 2025. The also has set an emissions budget for the years 2026 to 2030. That is part of the advice that we delivered through Aotearoa New Zealand, which was emissions budgets advice for the first 3 periods out to 2035, as well as advice on the emissions reduction plan for the first. Keep straight. Our draft advice is therefore focused on the direction of policy needed to achieve that second budget, building on the work already progressing and not reiterating or repeating all of our previous advice. To land on our 19 proposed recommendations, 2 of which are related to well-being, we use 2 frameworks drawing from the Act, a policy framework, which you can see on the screen here, and a prioritization framework. It's worth mentioning, just to go back there for a sec, it's worth mentioning the elements of the policy framework that you can see, kind of in the circle surrounding the inner circle, which is a weird thing to say, I know. 3 of the ways that we really looked at what are the actions required to achieve the second budget are related to making sure that prices are in place to influence investment and consumption decisions, that there are actions in place to address the barriers to change, and that we are enabling innovation and system transformation. And I think that these well-being elements uniquely are related to each of those 3 aspects in their own way. Next one. Anytime the Climate Change Commission does any work, the Climate Change Response Act tells us that we have to address the matters of Section 5M. This is one of those things that's written on the back of our eyelids for all of the staff here at the Commission. This is the parliamentarians' way of telling us to do thoughtful work that is considerate of multiple factors anytime we give advice to the government. The matters of 5M are listed on this slide, and as you can see, while well-being is not specifically named as one of the matters to consider, many of the determinants of well-being are named, and it is easy to understand how our advice has to be thoughtful towards this important element of the climate transition. Next slide. The transition to a low emissions future presents well-being opportunities for all New Zealanders. There is clear evidence that acting on climate has significant co-benefits, which can improve the health and well-being of our kids, whānau, and communities. The transition to low emissions is an opportunity to reduce ongoing costs faced by households. There are also challenges related to well-being that are important to consider, including those that come from increasingly severe and frequent climate events. Additionally, some people face barriers that limit their ability to take up options to reduce their emissions. This can prevent them from realizing cost savings that fuel switching or other climate-friendly choices can result in. A fair, inclusive, and equitable transition will help ensure the benefits of emissions reductions are achievable for all New Zealanders, making them more sustainable in the whole. A strong focus on well-being while taking climate action offers pathways towards greater equity for all of us. Not everyone experiences or will experience the impacts of a changing climate or the efforts to reduce emissions in the same way. Maori, young people, people with disabilities, and others face unique and disproportionate impacts potentially. Therefore, it will be important to consider intergenerational and social equity while making policies to transition to a low emissions, climate resilient future. This can lead to resilient communities, reduced poverty, greater social cohesion, and a more effective and durable response to climate change. Taking action on climate change can also improve well-being for many by reducing air pollution, reducing the costs associated with emissions that are priced increasingly in the future, improving building insulation, reducing the anxiety associated with the awareness that climate change will be an issue for future generations, enhancing transportation options and reducing congestion, protecting cultural taonga, making heating safer and more accessible in built environments, and by integrating the well-being of individuals and communities into climate action, policies will become more effective, inclusive, and capable of achieving long-lasting positive outcomes for both the people, the country, and the planet. Transitioning to a low emissions economy is likely to impact economic activity in a way that changes the patterns of employment across different sectors and geographies. For some sectors, such as renewable electricity generation and transport infrastructure, the transition will require more workers to support their growth. Some sectors tied to higher emissions, such as fossil fuel extraction, will likely require fewer workers in the future. Internationally, the evidence suggests growth in emissions-reducing sectors creates more jobs than those lost in those sectors associated with emissions-intensive activities. Actions like supporting small to medium businesses to participate in the transition to a low emissions economy, supporting good geographic matching of jobs and workers, and ensuring appropriate training and retraining opportunities are available for all workers can help make the most of opportunities presented by the transition to a low emissions economy. Just going to take a quick drink here. In our advice delivered to government in 2021, named Aotearoa New, we highlighted the importance of the way in which we transition to a low emissions, climate resilient economy in the future. We recommended that government develop a strategy in partnership with iwi and Maori that recognizes the shift to a sustainable, low emissions, and climate resilient future may impact groups differently, particularly vulnerable or marginalized populations. The government is progressing several actions to address well-being and equity in the transition, including regional just transition plans industry transformation plans across multiple sectors, and the equitable transition strategy that is currently under development and being led by MB, the Ministry of Business, Employment and Immigration, or Immigration and Employment. Whoops. The purpose of the equitable transition strategy is to ensure a fair and inclusive transition to a low emissions economy for all people and communities, with no one left behind. Currently, the strategy will only consider the impacts from emissions reduction policies. However, for its stated goals to be met, it is important for the strategy to consider adaptation needs and emissions reductions together. This will support the actions that address both the goals of both and avoid the risks that actions to reduce emissions could increase resiliency risks or vice versa. There are actions that can currently be taken even while the equitable transition strategy is under development. Targeting policies to support low-income groups to reduce their emissions or the impacts of emissions reduction actions can help those who need it most without being diffused across people who are able and ready to adjust. Targeted policies can help improve equity and achieve emissions reductions at the same time. Weakening action on climate policy during times of adverse economic or during times of adverse or challenging economic conditions, which climate change is only likely to exacerbate, we have sadly seen as of late, is not sustainable and will greatly compromise Aotearoa New Zealand's ability to meet the climate change targets that are set under the Climate Change Response Act. Ultimately, a fair, inclusive, and equitable transition means pursuing in parallel issues of social and economic equity and tackling climate change. One set of issues cannot be used to justify inaction in the other. In Chapter 6 of our draft advice that is out for consultation, the chapter's name is Maintaining and Enhancing Wellbeing Through the Transition. We propose that the emissions reduction plan for the second budget period must enable a fair, inclusive, and equitable transition for New Zealanders by expanding the scope of the equitable transition strategy to include the compounding impacts of climate change and adaptation, as well as mitigation. And make use of existing mechanisms to manage impacts of climate policies in the interim rather than delaying climate action. I'm just going to mute my microphone for a second and take a drink and a cough. I'll be right back. Apologies for that. Lots of talking today. I coughed too soon. So I think with that, Maya, I am in your hands. That is the content for the session and Chapter 6.
Kia ora. Thank you very much, Barry. So just a reminder that if you have any questions on what Barry has just shared with us, you're more than welcome to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Teams screen. We have had a few questions come in, Barry, during your presentation. So the first is, acknowledging that we're in a cost of living crisis here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and in many other places in the world, how does the Commission think about the need to balance climate change action with keeping life affordable for New Zealanders?
Thanks, Maya. I think that is right in the main of the I guess the second part of the recommendation, and that is about not letting is recognizing that there may be different drivers of challenging economic or social factors at any given point. But the fact of the matter is that a lack of climate action is only likely to compound and exacerbate such events in the future. In other words, actions now are worth a lot of avoided impacts later. And while it may be convenient to make short-term decisions today, there's probably not much benefit tomorrow and in the future. And that is very relevant, especially with respect to how some climate change action or policies may impact different parts of folks on the income distribution. And that's where we think that the government has a lot of tools in its toolbox today to mitigate undesirable impacts, and those tools should be used in order to enable outcomes, not delay action.
Kia ora, Barry. Another question that has come through, as the advice is in this on our direction of policy for the second emissions reduction plan is meant to be about emissions reduction, why does the Wellbeing chapter suggest including adaptation in the equitable transition strategy?
Sure. That's a good question. There is a part of the Climate Change Response Act that directs us when we do our emissions reduction advice that we essentially shall not provide advice to government to reduce emissions that also results in malinvestment or maladaptation, or, generally speaking, reduces resiliency. As such, given the fact that in this space, one of our, headline recommendations around an equitable transition strategy was taken up by government and was implemented and is under development by MV, we wanted to raise that resiliency is a key part of that. And increasingly in the future, it's going to be hard to disentangle, good policy around equitable transitions that is only for one and only for the other. And therefore, that's why we recommended that the government consider, or we have the draft recommendation out for consultation, that the government consider looking at those impacts together, and therefore crafting a strategy that will result in policy that is beneficial in both directions.
Kia ora, Barry. I am just going to see if any other questions have come through. Okay. So here is another question. Are there any thoughts about how we can finance the equitable transition? What about taxation as a lever, or is this out of scope? So I'll pass that to you, Barry, but I'll also note that we do have our funding and finance chapter in our draft advice as well, which covers this kind of in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, thanks for the question about where should the money come from. That's a very pragmatic question. If you look back in certain parts of an Aotearoa, a lot of times, or I guess even outside of an Aotearoa, this is a question that people ask about with respect to the NZETS, about what should the revenues be used for. In other jurisdictions, in other emissions pricing systems, part of the revenue is recycled and given back to households in the form of lump sum payments or other ways of revenue recycling, so that the regressive impacts of emissions pricing are muted. The Commission hasn't taken a stance or prescriptive approach to how the revenues from an emissions pricing system should be used, but we do raise in an Aotearoa that that's a proper, big P public policy decision, and there are implications and trade-offs for using that revenue in different ways. If you use it to mitigate regressive impacts, then you may not use that money, for example, to invest in research and development on the other hand. And that the trade-offs and the decisions for how to use such revenues should be thoughtful and careful. Also, it's incredibly likely that any of the revenue resulting from an emissions pricing system may not be sufficient to fund all the things that are socially desirable. And therefore, as you've raised through your question, should other things be funded through other mechanisms, such as general revenue or the more common avenues of government?
Kia ora. Just going to see if any other questions have come through the stream. Just give folks a few more moments in case there are any questions that people are typing. Okay, so we've had one come in here. How does the Commission define equitable? So when we talk about a fair, inclusive, equitable transition, does that take into account varied responsibility or ability to absorb costs and or losses?
I'm just looking up. I have the if you're able to write down a note for the person who asked the question, if you look at page 83 on the draft advice that's out for consultation right now, there's a section of it called Climate Policies for a Fair, Inclusive, and Equitable Transition. And so maybe I'll just give a highlight about an overview about what that section says. And it says, one of the key elements of that are helping to address or overcome barriers that exist to make it harder to access energy savings. The impacts of emissions pricing are likely to be moderate, but could be inequitable and could be inequitable if improperly managed. And the risk of inequitable impacts on households can be managed with targeted approaches to policy. So I think, generally speaking, it's a really thoughtful question because it's a really, I guess that's a word that could mean many things to different people. Through this work, I think we're mobilizing, or we're using the working definition of that is basically having climate change policy that results in improved outcomes, both for the climate and for the population, and that any, I guess, inequities or historical grievances or things that are the result of past situations are not exacerbated by climate change action, but hopefully instead are improved as a result of smart and decisive action being taken.
Thank you, Barry. We've had another patai come through. What work has been done concerning mental health and climate change? What mental health tools are being developed? I think this question is maybe thinking about some of the negative mental health consequences related to climate change anxiety, which you touched on a bit. And I know that the draft advice also talks about how especially rangatahi are impacted by looking at a sort of uncertain future and the way that some of the anxieties related to climate change hit certain communities potentially harder than some others, depending on their circumstance.
Thanks for the question. I think it's a really reasonable one, and especially this question hinges on one of the, or it's really in line with one of the matters of 5M, which is we have to take into account intergenerational equity or intergenerational kind of trade-offs in cost and benefits. And I think the reality is that, part of the equitable transition strategy that MB is working on is related to this, but I would urge you to go and look at that work. That's if you Google equitable transition strategy in MB, you should find what's going on there, and form your own opinion on if you think that the work underway by the government right now is comprehensive enough for the concerns that you've raised. I think with the work that the Act directs us to do in this space, we are super focused on making sure the government has strategic direction to meet its second emissions budget period. And the well-being impacts of action and sustained, reasonable approaches to climate change policy, hopefully, can help improve the mental health and the long-term concerns about where we're going as a world. I know that that's an easy thing to say and a hard thing to suppose there's a direct response of do action, have less worry. But nonetheless, I do acknowledge the point that you've raised, and I do think that if you read the advice or you read the draft advice and think that there are important elements of the well-being chapter or maybe other parts of the draft advice that are undercooked with respect to the point you've raised, then these are exactly the kind of inputs that we'd like to receive through the consultation window to be able to improve the advice and adapt it as required.
Barry. Just give one more opportunity in case there are any other questions that folks would like to put forward. Hapai, it doesn't look like we've got anything further coming through. So I think we'll begin wrapping up this session for now. I want to thank everyone again for joining us and for sharing your questions with us, as well as your time. As I said previously, if you have any further questions after we've closed for today, you are more than welcome to email us at hello@climatecommission.govt.nz. I do think we've got a few slides just talking about the consultation window. I don't know if we want to bring those up. And if not, I can just kind of talk to that window. So we are nearing the end of our consultation. So that will be closing on the 20th of June, which is in just 4 days' time. So this consultation has been an 8-week period. We began consultation on the 26th of April. And as I say, we will be closing it on the 20th of June. So if you do have any feedback on what you heard today, or if you have any feedback on our draft advice as a whole, or any other areas of advice that we are proposing to provide to the government, please do go to our website, and there is a portal for an online submission. You can provide us with your thoughts by engaging with the survey, or if you would like to provide us with some evidence that you would like us to have another look at, there is a place where you can submit that as well. And we certainly welcome that. As Barry said, that the purpose of this engagement and this consultation is to strengthen our advice. And we're very committed to shaping our advice around the strongest evidence. And we are certainly looking for additional robust evidence if it is out there. So we really appreciate any submissions that you have that will improve our ability to provide advice to the government on its upcoming second emissions reduction plan. Our advice will be provided to the government at the end of this year. So after we receive all of the submissions, we'll have a period of review and any revision as appropriate before providing that advice. So I'd now like to invite Bevan to join us again, and if Ehua, you would please close us with karakia.
Tēnā koutou mua koutou tini whakaaro me ngā awhina I tukua mai hei tautoko I tā tātou hui me te kaupapa nei, anei te karakia whakamutunga. Kia tau, kia tātou katoa, te ata whai o tō tātou ariki a ihu karaiti, me te aroha o te atua, me te whiwhinga tahitanga o te wairua tapu, ake, āmini. Kia ora tātou.
Amine. Kia ora, Bevan. Once again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and a fantastic weekend, and we look forward to receiving your submissions. Kia ora tātou.